The truth is simple and cruel. Why it sucked to be a Viking blacksmith and more can be felt from the moment a Viking child first opened his smoke-stung eyes inside a forge. There was no nobility in the soot-choked hut, no golden hall of kings, no feasts of Viking food to greet the boy. Only the hiss of iron, the roar of fire, and a father's calloused hand thrusting tongs into his grip before he could speak properly. A Viking man might dream of raiding with the sea kings or wielding a sword with glory, but if you were born into the line of smiths, your destiny was already shackled to the anvil. From the moment you could stand without tumbling into the coals, you belonged to the fire. By 6 winters, your toys were replaced with hammers. By 10, your games were long gone, replaced by sparks that burned into your flesh like the marks of unseen gods. Childhood was not a phase in a blacksmith's life, it was stolen outright. While other Viking boys chased goats in the meadow or wrestled for sport, you learned the hard language of iron. That language was not written in words, but in burns, blisters, and bruises. The forge itself was a beast, a living thing with a hunger that never stilled. It demanded wood, demanded breath from your lungs as you worked the bellows, demanded sweat until your tunic clung to you like wet ash. The heat was not warmth, it was punishment. Flames licked your skin, reminding you each moment that to falter was to be scarred. And above all stood the Viking father, a towering figure with a voice of growls, teaching not by kindness but by command. "Strike harder," he would say, and your arm would quake until it obeyed. The world outside hardly noticed you. Viking traders sailed, warriors raided, and skalds sang in smoky halls, but you were bent over iron from dawn until night. You were not part of their songs. You were the hidden hand that made the sword, the nails that held a ship together, the chain that bound a gate. And yet, in your own hall, there was no song, no laughter, only the endless rhythm of hammer and hiss, like a grim heartbeat. It was a cursed birthright. No crown, no feast, no tale of fame awaited the blacksmith's son, only soot in his hair, pain in his hands, and the endless roar of fire in his ears. And so, from your very first breath near the anvil, you understood why it sucked to be a Viking blacksmith, and more, it was not life, but survival, hammered into shape one blister at a time. The tools of a Viking blacksmith were not gentle companions. They were beasts of iron, cruel and unyielding, and every day you wrestled with them, as if your own survival depended upon it, which it did. The hammer was no mere object. It was the tyrant of your life, a weight that dragged down your arms, bent your shoulders, and shaped your very bones. Strike after strike, hour after hour, the hammer taught you that mastery came not through glory, but through pain. Each blow carried the fire's command. Each swing stole a little more of your strength, until your body itself became as twisted and scarred as the metal you forged. A Viking man could wield a sword, feel its balance, and call it noble. But you, bound to the forge, wielded a hammer that showed no nobility. It bruised your palms raw, split your skin until blood ran into the cracks of the handle, and mocked you with its endless demand for more. You learned to grip it tighter than life itself, to let the weight drive through your shoulder into the iron. And when your grip faltered, when sweat slicked your hand, the hammer bit back. Bruised knuckles, torn nails, shattered joints, these were your daily bread. The tongs were no kinder. They clamped hot iron like a serpent writhing in your grasp, always eager to slip free and scorch your flesh. A Viking child in the forge quickly learned the sting of glowing sparks, leaping like fireflies from the anvil, biting into arms, neck, and face. You flinched once, then never again, for flinching brought laughter from your master and pain from the steel. The tools taught you harsh lessons, obedience, endurance, silence. Every tool was a double-edged oath. The chisel dulled and needed sharpening until your fingers blistered from the whetstone. The file rasped not only iron, but the skin from your grip. Even the apron you wore to shield yourself was no friend. It caught sparks and molten drops, trapping them against your body so they seared deeper. To work was to suffer, and to suffer was to learn. The forge echoed with these torments. The hammer's ring was not a song of creation, but a war drum pounding into your ears, a rhythm that never ended. The hiss of iron plunged into water was the sound of your own flesh, for you knew the sensation all too well. Day by day, the tools reshaped you as surely as you reshaped the iron. Your arms thickened, your back stooped, your hands became claws of callus and scar. You were no longer a boy, or even a man. You were an extension of your tools, a Viking creature half human, half forge. So it was with the hammer's grip. It carved you into its servant, ruled your body like a lord rules his thralls, and though you cursed it, you could never cast it aside. For without the tools, there was no bread, no roof, no life. They were your torment, but also your chain, and the forge demanded you never let go. The fire was no servant, it was master, devouring everything within reach, and the Viking blacksmith lived chained to its hunger. From dawn until the last star blinked, the forge roared like a living beast, its belly never full, its breath always hot enough to peel skin from bone. A Viking man who farmed might fear winter frost. A Viking child might dread hunger. But for the blacksmith, the terror was fire itself. Not the distant cleansing flame of a hearth, but a furnace that never slept, never forgave, and slowly cooked the very marrow of its keeper. You felt it before you saw it. Heat pressed against your chest, crawling into your lungs with every breath. Sweat poured as if your blood itself was boiling, stinging your eyes until the world blurred into shapes of red and shadow. The forge did not let you stand at its side, it dragged you into its embrace, wrapped you in smoke until your skin carried the scent of burning flesh. To work with it was to be marked forever. Your arms darkened, not with the sun, but with the soot of endless flame. Scars crisscrossed your hands, your neck, your chest, each one a memory of a spark that leapt too far, or an ember that kissed too long. Even Viking food tasted of the fire. Bread carried the grit of ash. Salted fish was swallowed with the bitter tang of smoke, and mead itself seemed to echo the furnace when it burned down your throat. Sleep offered no escape. When you closed your eyes, you still saw the red glow, still heard the crackle, still twitched as if sparks were falling on your flesh. Your dreams were lit with fire, and your waking was worse. The forge consumed more than flesh. It ate strength, spirit, and years. The fire dried your skin until it cracked like old leather, filled your lungs with smoke until every cough drew up blackness, and bent your spine with the constant labour of feeding it. A Viking warrior might fall with his sword, swift and proud. The blacksmith fell slowly, roasted by inches, until his body was as brittle as the bones he buried in the ground. And yet you could not hate it, for the fire was your prison and your purpose. It was the force that turned raw ore into the tools of survival, the swords of kings, the rivets that bound the ships of raiders. Without it, no Viking man could raid, no Viking woman could cook, no Viking child could be clothed or shod. The fire destroyed you, but it also made you necessary. So you stood beside it, day after day, knowing that every breath was a bargain, every scar a tax. The furnace took, and it always took more than it gave. That was the fate of the Viking blacksmith, to be consumed alive, one blister, one breath, one burning moment at a time. Childhood was a fleeting dream, stolen the moment a Viking child was born into the house of a blacksmith. From the first cry, his cradle was not soft straw or woven cloth, but a corner of the forge where the air was thick with smoke and the hiss of iron was a lullaby. There were no toys carved from wood, no playful hours chasing goats or splashing in the fjord. Instead, his playthings were tongs, his games were sparks, and his lessons were burns that seared deeper than words. Childhood ended before it ever began, traded for bellows, coal, and soot. By 6 winters, he was no longer a boy. He was an apprentice, though the word carried little kindness. It meant rising before the sun, stoking the forge, and working the bellows until his thin arms trembled like saplings in the wind. It meant sweeping ash from the dirt floor, hauling buckets of water heavy enough to bend his spine, and watching with wide eyes as iron glowed red, daring him to come too close. A Viking man might remember laughter in his youth, but the blacksmith's son remembered only the ache of endless toil. The forge itself showed no mercy. Sparks leapt onto bare skin, leaving tiny constellations of scars across a child's arms and cheeks. Soot painted his face so dark that even his mother's hand could not scrub it away. The smell of smoke sank into his hair, his tunic, his very flesh, until he carried the forge with him wherever he went. Other Viking children mocked him, calling him coalface, iron breath, but he had no time to answer. Work silenced him, and the fire consumed him. There were no games of stick fighting in the meadow, no races along the shore, no stolen moments of idleness beneath the summer Sunday. While Viking boys dreamed of raids and Viking girls sang by the loom, the blacksmith's child bent over nails, horseshoes, and crude tools, each one scorned by his father until it was perfect. His only rewards were grunts of approval, the occasional scrap of Viking food shoved into his hands, and another lesson carved in heat and hammer. Yet in the quiet moments, when the fire dimmed and the hammer paused, he felt something stirring. The forge was cruel, but it was also alive, a beast that demanded his fear yet offered a strange, grim purpose. Childhood was gone, stolen by the fire, but in its place was a strange inheritance, arms growing hard before their time, hands roughened into claws, and a spirit tempered like steel. Still, the cost was high. For every year spent in the forge, he lost a year of laughter, a year of innocence, a year of freedom. And so the blacksmith's son carried into manhood not memories of games or joy, but the weight of iron, the scars of fire, and the truth that in his world, a Viking child's youth was never his own. It belonged to the forge. The forge was no place for gentle words. A Viking child born to a blacksmith did not learn through song or tender instruction, but through the harsh tongue of fire and iron. His father spoke little, for the forge had burned softness out of him long ago. What remained was a language without letters, grunts, gestures, and the ringing of steel. A lifted brow meant strike again. A scowl meant you had failed. And, if the boy was truly unlucky, a heavy cuff to the ear, or a thrown horseshoe, was the punctuation of the lesson. This was the language of iron, carved into the body long before it settled in the mind. The Viking man at the anvil did not explain why the hammer must fall true. He simply slammed down his own blow, sparks flying like a storm, daring the boy to mimic him or be shamed. The rhythm of work was the grammar, the hiss of water on glowing steel, the pause between sentences. Each mistake was met not with patience but with silence heavy enough to crush the spirit, or worse, a grunt that cut sharper than any blade. In this school there were no scrolls, no runes to study, only scars to remind you of what you had done wrong. A Viking child at the bellows soon learned to count not in numbers, but in strokes of the hammer, in the time it took iron to glow from black to red, from red to white. His father's nod was rarer than gold, and when it came, it meant more than any spoken praise. But most often, the boy was met with gritted teeth, a scornful glance, or a wordless hand thrust forward, demanding another tool. Even the silence had meaning. It told him he was too slow, too weak, too small to master the forge's will. Pain was the true teacher. Burns blistered the skin where hands lingered too close. Bruises bloomed where hammers struck poorly. The weight of iron shaped not only metal but bone, bending shoulders, thickening arms, hardening the body into something closer to the tools it served. A Viking blacksmith's son became fluent in agony, understanding that every scar was a word, every injury a phrase in the cruel lexicon of his trade. Yet there was a strange bond within this silence. Though the father seemed made of stone, his son came to read him, as surely as the runes etched in oak. A grunt might hide pride, a scowl might conceal worry. The boy learned to see the unspoken, to hear the rhythm beneath the noise, to understand that the forge itself spoke louder than men ever could. This was the language of iron. It had no softness, no gentleness, no wasted syllables. It was taught in fire, written in sweat, remembered in scars. And once learned, it could never be forgotten, for it shaped not only the Viking man who laboured at the anvil, but every soul bound to the forge. There was no escaping it. Sweat, smoke, and soot were the three companions of every Viking blacksmith, and they clung tighter than kin. From the moment the fire was stoked at dawn until it smouldered in the night, the forge exhaled its poison, filling every breath with ash. A Viking man in the fields might complain of the summer sun or the stink of fish along the shore, but those were passing discomforts. For the blacksmith, the very air itself was the enemy, a choking fog that coiled into his lungs and blackened them like charred wood. Sweat poured in rivers, soaking through wool and leather until garments stiffened and stank. It wasn't the sweat of battle, earned in a single clash of swords, but a ceaseless stream, dripping hour after hour, year after year. A Viking child, pressed to the bellows, would taste it running into his mouth, salted and bitter, the flavour of his own toil. No amount of Viking food, no ale or mead could wash it away. The sweat was constant, a reminder that his body served the fire long before it served itself. Smoke rose thicker than mist upon the fjords. It wrapped around beams, seeped into walls, and turned every surface to shadow. The blacksmith lived in it, as a fish lives in water. It stung the eyes until tears cut clean lines through soot-smeared cheeks. It filled the throat with grit, making each word rasp like gravel. Even laughter, rare as it was, came out as a cough. And when night fell, the smoke did not leave it followed, clinging to hair, to skin, to bedclothes. A Viking wife could tell a blacksmith by scent alone, for he carried the forge upon him even as he slept. And then there was the soot. It blackened the hands until they looked carved from coal, worked its way under nails that would never be clean again. It stained tunics beyond washing, turning cloth to rags stiff with filth. It lived in the cracks of skin, in the corners of eyes, in the folds of breath itself. Even children of the forge bore it. A Viking child growing in such a house wore soot like a birthmark, his face marked long before he became a man. In time, the body yielded. Lungs filled with ash, leaving the blacksmith wheezing like an old hound by 30 winters. Every cough spat darkness, every breath rattled like a bellows breaking. There was no cure, no escape, only the slow surrender to the forge's poison. This was life for the Viking blacksmith. No feast could cleanse it, no river could wash it, no prayer could lift it away. Sweat, smoke, and soot, these were his inheritance, his curse, and his crown of ashes, and he wore it every day, until breath itself gave way. The tools of the forge were no friends to the Viking blacksmith. They were iron beasts with tempers of their own, and more often than not, they bit harder than the metal being shaped. The hammer was heavy, but it was loyal. The others, the tongs, chisels, and even the anvil itself, seemed to plot against the man who wielded them. Every scar on a Viking hand told a story, not of battle with sword or axe, but of betrayal by the very tools meant to serve. The tongs were the worst traitors. They slipped when the iron hissed and writhed like a living serpent, pinching skin instead of gripping metal. More than one Viking child in apprenticeship screamed as glowing iron scorched his arm because the tongs turned treacherous at the wrong moment. A blacksmith learned quickly that a careless hold meant a burn that would blister for weeks. His father offered no comfort, only a grunt and the words, "Grip harder," in the forge. Mercy was weakness, and even the tools demanded strength. The chisels had their own cruelty. their edges dulled at the worst times, forcing the smith to press harder until the blade slipped and carved into his hand instead of the iron. Blood dripping onto hot steel sizzled and smoked, a sound every Viking man of the forge knew well. There was no pause for healing. Wrap it in cloth, curse the gods, and strike again, that was the rule. Flesh was expendable, but the work was not. Even the anvil, that solid block of iron, betrayed its master. Strike at the wrong angle, and the hammer would rebound, smashing into a wrist or splitting a finger. The anvil gave no warning, no forgiveness. Its flat face seemed to mock the man hunched over it, as if reminding him that he was as much prisoner as craftsman. In time, the blacksmith's body became a map of these battles. Fingers bent crooked from breaks, nails torn or missing, skin so thick with scars it barely felt touch. A Viking warrior might earn marks from blade and spear, but the blacksmith's wounds were quieter, hidden in the calloused palms and swollen joints of a man who spent his life wrestling with stubborn iron and treacherous tools. Yet he could not hate them. For all their cruelty, these tools were his lifeblood. Without them, no sword would gleam, no plough would turn soil, no chain would hold firm. They hurt him, but they also bound him to his purpose. The Viking blacksmith knew that each scar was both a wound and a badge, proof that he had survived another day in the fire's grip. The tools bit, the tools bled him, but he bore it, because without them he was nothing, and with them he was everything the village could not live without. The forge devoured more food than any man ever could, and the Viking blacksmith was forced to eat only what was left. His life was a fire that demanded fuel, yet his own body was given little more than scraps. Day after day he laboured, arms swinging, lungs burning, sweat pouring like rain, but when the time came to eat, there was no feast waiting. While a Viking warrior might return from a raid to salted meats, mead, and steaming platters of Viking food, the blacksmith found only coarse bread, hard enough to chip a tooth, salted fish, stiff with brine, or a bowl of thin turnip pottage that did little more than fill the belly with air. The food was never enough. He burned through every crumb the moment he set hammer to iron, his muscles crying out for meat, for strength, for something richer than scraps. But the forge did not care. Hunger was an ache that became as constant as the smoke in his lungs. He ate standing, one hand still clutching tongs, swallowing fast before the fire demanded his return. Flavour was a luxury he forgot. Bread tasted of ash, fish of smoke, broth of soot. The forge seasoned all things the same. A Viking child in the smith's household learned early that food was not for pleasure. Meals were snatched in haste, hunks of bread torn with blackened fingers, a mouthful of cold ale to wash down soot. Meat, when it appeared, was a festival. A scrap of pork fat, a bone with marrow, a dried strip of venison, these were treasures more precious than silver. Yet even then, he might chew quickly, because the hammer called him back before he could savour it. Hunger was never sated, it was only delayed. Others in the village ate better. Farmers feasted on milk, cheese, and roasted goat. Fishermen filled their bellies with fresh catch straight from the fjord. Raiders returned with plunder, sharing barrels of ale and platters of roasted meat. The blacksmith? He worked while they ate, and when he finally sat down, it was to scraps, cold and flavourless, left behind as though he were an afterthought. Even Viking women, who cooked meals for their households, could not hide the shame of what little reached his bowl. Still, the blacksmith endured. His body grew hard, not from nourishment, but from sheer will, hardened like the iron he hammered. Every swing of the hammer was stolen from his own flesh, every spark paid for with hunger gnawing his belly. He did not eat for strength, nor for joy he ate to keep the fire burning, to keep his arms moving, to keep the village alive. So it was for the Viking blacksmith. Food was never truly his. It was fuel for the forge, borrowed through his body, consumed by the fire. And when he swallowed his last bite at night, it was not for himself, but for the hammer that awaited him at dawn. Sleep was meant to be a gift, a soft cloak to shelter the weary. But for the Viking blacksmith, it was a curse as cruel as the fire itself. After a day of hammering iron until arms shook and bones ached, he did not collapse into deep rest. Instead, he lay upon his straw sack, with muscles twitching, ears still echoing with the clang of steel, mind racing, as though the forge itself had followed him into the night. The ringing never left. The hammer's blow, the hiss of quenched metal, the wheeze of the bellows, all of it became a phantom chorus that played long after the flames died. Even in silence, his skull throbbed with their rhythm. A Viking man who spent his day at sea might fall into dreamless slumber, rocked by the waves, but the blacksmith's body refused him such mercy. He would shift upon his bedding, shoulders burning, back stiff, hands clawed into shapes that no longer remembered softness. The night offered no coolness. His body radiated heat as though he had swallowed the forge whole. Sweat dampened his bedding, sour and heavy, stinking of soot and fire. A Viking child pressed into apprenticeship would whimper in his sleep, still flinching from sparks that had fallen on him during the day. Even the blacksmith's dreams were not escapes, but torment visions of glowing iron that bent wrong, of tools slipping, of his father's harsh grunt telling him to strike again. He dreamed of work, and in those dreams he laboured until dawn. When true sleep finally came, it was shallow, restless, broken by sudden jerks of the body, as though he still swung the hammer. His arms moved in phantom strikes, his fists clenched at nothing, his breath ragged like the bellows he worked by day. And when he woke, there was no refreshment. His limbs were heavy, his chest tight, his eyes stung as if filled with ash. Fatigue clung to him like another layer of soot, never scrubbed away, never eased. The curse of no sleep aged him before his years. A Viking warrior might boast of scars upon his body, but the blacksmith bore scars carved by exhaustion, lines etched deep into his face, hollows under his eyes that marked him as one who never truly rested. His spirit dulled, his temper sharpened, for a man starved of sleep is quick to anger and slow to joy. Yet he rose each morning still. The forge did not wait, and the village did not care for his weariness. The fire roared, the hammer demanded, and his body obeyed, though it longed to collapse. For the Viking blacksmith, sleep was no refuge. It was stolen, broken, poisoned by the very echoes of his craft. And so he lived half awake, half dreaming, never free from the curse of the forge that followed him even into the night. A Viking blacksmith's true curse was not only the fire or the hunger, but his own hands, betrayers that carried both his craft and his ruin. From the first day a Viking child wrapped his fingers around a hammer, the slow undoing began. Soft skin hardened into callus, nails split against iron, and blisters rose like angry welts, bursting and scarring, until the flesh looked more like bark than flesh. By the time most Viking men were growing into their strength, the blacksmith's hands were already old, stiff, and ruined. Every strike of the hammer carved its toll. Knuckles swelled until they no longer bent easily. Palms cracked in winter, bleeding lines so deep they burned with every grip. The forge spared nothing. Red-hot shards bit into the skin, leaving spots of raw flesh that healed poorly and reopened with each day's labour. A blacksmith soon stopped counting the cuts and burns. They became as common as breath, each one layered upon the next, until his hands carried the story of every mistake, every battle with iron, every moment of pain. Blisters were the constant companions. A new apprentice, a Viking child scarcely tall enough to reach the anvil, would earn them within the first day. They would swell, break, and leave the skin raw, only to harden again into thick callus. This was the forge's way of reshaping flesh into tools. Yet even calluses betrayed him, splitting without warning, leaving hands slick with blood that mixed with soot until it looked as though the iron itself had bitten him. Nails fared no better. Some blackened from repeated blows, others tore away altogether when caught by a slipping chisel or stubborn tongs. A blacksmith's fingers, once nimble in youth, grew crooked and blunt, incapable of the gentleness needed to hold a quill or to caress the cheek of a Viking woman without roughness. His grip was strong enough to crush, but too ruined for tenderness. In time, the hands themselves grew alien. They shook in the cold, stiffened in the damp, and ached with a deep pain that no herb or Viking food could ease. They betrayed him at the worst moments, trembling when steadiness was needed most, dropping tools that once felt like extensions of his very being. And yet, despite their ruin, he could not rest them. The forge demanded more, and so he swung, gripped, and bled, even as his body cried for mercy. A Viking warrior might lose fingers in battle and gain honour. The blacksmith lost his slowly, one cracked nail, one burned fingertip at a time, and there was no song for him. His hands were his pride, his curse, and his doom. They built swords and ships for others, but for him they offered only pain. In the end, the hands that gave life to the Viking world betrayed their master, leaving him broken long before his youth had passed. The Viking blacksmith carried a smell that no washing could hide, a stench that clung to him as surely as iron clings to fire. It was the reek of smoke, sweat, and scorched leather, a foul perfume that marked him long before he entered a hall. Where a Viking warrior might stride in with salt on his skin from the sea, or the musky scent of horse and battle, the blacksmith brought with him the forge itself. He smelled of ash lodged deep in his hair, of sweat baked into his tunic, of hides singed and smouldering under his touch. This odour did not fade with scrubbing. The soot burrowed into the pores, the sweat turned sour before midday, and the heat of the forge burned its way into every fibre of his clothing. Even Viking food, when he ate, tasted of it, bread flavoured by the smoke clinging to his fingers, fish carrying the bitter tang of ash. His very breath carried iron's bitterness, as though the metal itself had fused with his lungs. A Viking woman might admire the skill of a blacksmith, but few dreamed of lying beside him. At night, when others shared furs scented faintly with mead or pine smoke, the blacksmith carried a smell of toil too strong to ignore. His skin reeked of old sweat that no river bath could cleanse, his beard of embers long since cold. A Viking child, pressed close to his father, would wrinkle his nose, for even affection was tainted by the forge's stink. It marked him as apart, a man useful yet undesirable. In feasting halls, men shifted slightly when he sat too near, though none would say it aloud. The scent of the forge was respected, but never loved. It reminded them of toil, of labour unending, of heat and grime that no warrior's glory could match. Where a raider's scars were badges, the blacksmith's smell was a curse, one that followed him like a shadow. And so the blacksmith lived with it, enduring the whispers unspoken, the distance in a woman's gaze. He bore it as he bore the burns on his arms and the cracks in his hands. He told himself that this was the price of shaping swords and axes, the cost of making the tools that carved the Viking world. Yet when the hall quieted and a woman's laughter rose from the benches, he knew his lot. He was the man of fire, but never of tenderness. The smell was not merely on him, it was him. The forge had claimed his flesh, his lungs, his very scent, until he no longer belonged to hearth or hall. For the Viking blacksmith, even his smell was a prison, a constant reminder that he was married first and forever to the fire. The Viking blacksmith was no free man in spirit, though none bound him in chains. He was the village's slave, tied not by rope or iron shackles, but by endless demand. From the break of dawn to the fall of night, there was always another voice at his door, another need thrust upon his weary shoulders. A hinge snapped on a chest, the blacksmith must fix it. A plough dulled in the frozen soil, the blacksmith must sharpen it. A blade nicked in some drunken brawl, the blacksmith must mend it before the warrior strutted again with pride. He belonged not to himself, but to all. A Viking farmer looked to him for tools to tear the earth. A Viking warrior looked to him for weapons to draw blood. A Viking woman brought broken cauldrons, kettles, and knives, her gaze expectant, never grateful. Even the Viking child, who shattered an iron clasp on a toy bowstring, was sent to the blacksmith, as though the forge were there for whims as much as for war. And never was there thanks. No man toasted him when the plough turned soil rich with promise. No warrior sang his name after a sword he had hammered split an enemy's shield. His work was invisible in glory, visible only when absent. Should an axe break in battle, the curse fell on his name. Should a hinge sag or a chain snap, the whispers turned sharp. In this way, the blacksmith carried blame far heavier than any hammer. He could not refuse. To deny a request was to invite the scorn of the hall, to be branded as lazy, dishonourable, or worse. A Viking man might die with a blade in hand, but the blacksmith lived chained to the anvil, his life spent fueling the strength of others. He had no feasts of victory, no spoils from raiding shores, no songs sung of his deeds. His hall was the forge, his reward the ash that blackened his skin. At times, he must have wondered what freedom tasted like. To walk as a Viking warrior beneath open skies, to raid for silver, to sail on the wind instead of breathing smoke. But those dreams withered in the smoke of the furnace. The village owned his hands, his sweat, his very hours, and he knew it. The Viking blacksmith was needed, but never celebrated. His labour held the world together, yet it left him nameless. In the end, he was a servant to all, a slave not bought, but bound enslaved by the village's endless hunger for iron, and cursed to live a life where service was demanded and thanks never given. When war came, it was not only the warriors who bled. The Viking blacksmith felt its weight with every hammer's strike, for war fed the forge, and the forge demanded his life as much as the battlefield claimed others. At the first whisper of raiding season, men crowded his smoky hut, tossing down battered swords, splintered shields, and bent spears, their voices urgent with talk of plunder and glory. For the warrior, war promised silver. For the blacksmith, it promised only fire without rest. The bellows roared day and night, the anvil rang like a war drum, and sparks lit the dark like stars that never ceased to fall. Each sword he forged was a tongue of flame made solid, each arrowhead a seed of death, and as he worked, he knew his creations would not return whole. A Viking man who took a sword from his hand might return broken, or not at all. The blacksmith's craft gave others their chance at glory, but it chained him deeper to ash and sorrow. Coin did flow when war brewed, yes, but what did it buy? More iron to hammer, more coal to burn, more sweat to pour upon the anvil. The blacksmith never touched the treasure taken from foreign coasts. The silver arm ring, the gold brooch, the fine goblet, these sat in the hands of the Viking chieftain or warrior, while the blacksmith's hands cracked and bled into the soot. Payment filled his belly, perhaps bought a strip of meat or Viking food to last the week, but it never freed him from the forge. Worse still, war made him complicit in death. Each weapon carried his mark, though no saga would ever speak it. A Viking child, left fatherless after some raid, might grow up never knowing the blacksmith's role in arming the man who struck the blow, yet the truth clung to him like the soot in his lungs. His hammers did not only shape iron, they shaped the fates of men. And when the raiders returned, drunk on blood and mead, the blacksmith's toil began anew. Broken blades tossed at his feet, shields rent by axes, helmets bent in by spears, all to be reforged in endless cycle. He saw victory not in songs, but in the heap of ruined iron that proved how costly it had been. Thus war was a curse in disguise, a feast that only left him hungrier. The Viking blacksmith's fire thrived on bloodshed, but the price was his strength, his years, and his soul. For when war fed the forge, the blacksmith himself was the true offering, consumed by the flames that armed his people's glory. When the swords were sheathed, and the longships rested on their keels, the blacksmith's world grew quiet, but not in the way of peace. For him, peace was no gift. It was a hunger that gnawed at his ribs, a silence that mocked the clang of hammer and the hiss of iron. When war raged, his fire roared, his hands never still. But when calm swept the land, the forge grew cold, and the Viking blacksmith was left to scratch for scraps. In those days, no warrior came thundering to his door, no farmer pressed silver into his hand for new blades. Instead, a Viking woman might arrive with a cracked pot, asking it to be patched, offering in payment a crust of bread. A Viking man might bring a broken clasp or a dented cauldron, and for the long hours of heating and hammering, the smith received little more than thanks, if even that. More often, it was a handful of turnips or a strip of dried fish, barely enough to keep the fire in his own belly alive. The blacksmith's fire wanted fuel, his body wanted meat, and yet peace starved both. The hammer grew heavy when it struck not iron destined for war, but the dull tasks of peace. Hinges, horseshoes, rivets for barrels work that earned little, that wore him down without raising him high. He would sit by his anvil, staring at the dying coals, wondering if peace was not deadlier than battle itself. For a Viking warrior might die swiftly with an axe in his chest, but the blacksmith wasted slowly, fading under the weight of hunger and want. The village forgot him when there was no war. The chieftain's eye turned to feasts, the farmer to his fields, the raider to his mead. None thought of the blacksmith unless something cracked or bent. His skill, once demanded with shouts, now went begging. He became a shadow at the edge of the hall, hoping for leftover Viking food, hoping for some token of trade to keep his children fed. And worse, he knew the cruelty of dependence. He could not wish for peace, though it spared lives, for peace starved him. Yet when war returned, he cursed the endless work that burned his hands to the bone. Between hunger and fire, the blacksmith lived always in chains, never free, never full. So when the village celebrated calm seas and safe harvests, the blacksmith's heart tightened, for he knew what peace meant, not comfort, not ease, but empty bellies, patched pots, and long nights staring into cold ash. In peace, the forge starved, and with it, so did the man who lived and died by its fire. The blacksmith's curse was not only the fire that scorched his flesh, or the hammer that bruised his bones. It was the endless cycle, the truth that his work was never finished, never complete. Fix one thing, and 3 more would break. Such was the lot of a Viking smith, chained not by iron shackles but by the demands of his people, a cycle without end. At dawn, before a Viking child stirred from his straw bed, the blacksmith was already at the forge. The first hammer's ring called across the village, echoing like a crow's cry, and before long the line began. A Viking man with a shield splintered in a brawl, a farmer with a plough cracked by stubborn earth, a woman with a cooking pot warped by flame. Each brought their burden, and each expected it mended, and once the work was done, the pile only grew higher, never lower. The iron itself mocked him. A hinge hammered true would creak within weeks. A nail forged straight would bend beneath careless hands. Even the weapons he laboured over with all his strength came back dented, split, or dulled. Nothing endured, nothing lasted. His sweat seemed to vanish into air, his toil consumed like smoke. And yet, if he faltered, the village would falter with him. Without his work, doors sagged, carts collapsed, and warriors rode to battle unarmed. His forge was the unseen pillar of Viking life, but to him it was a chain that offered no rest. Even in sleep, the cycle haunted him. He dreamed of the hammer falling again and again, of sparks stinging his eyes, of broken tools piled higher than the roof of his hut. He would wake with muscles still aching, ears still ringing, only to rise and face the same heap of demands. The forge was not a place of creation to him. It was a pit that devoured all time, all energy, all hope. And still he endured, for what choice had he? A Viking blacksmith could not walk away from his forge, just as a warrior could not flee the shield wall. His place was bound, his hands shackled by duty as much as by need. The cycle turned, and he turned with it, like a wheel grinding him down day by day. Thus his life was no saga of triumph, no tale sung in halls. It was a grindstone that wore him to dust, a cycle without end. And though the village praised the strength of its warriors and the cunning of its chieftains, the blacksmith knew the deeper truth. His work was eternal, but his body was not. The cycle would outlast him, and only the ashes of his forge would remember his name. The curse of the forge was never buried with the man who bore it. It passed like smoke from one generation to the next, seeping into the lungs of the blacksmith's children before they had even tasted freedom. The blacksmith's son did not inherit land or silver. He inherited scars. From the moment his hands could grip the bellows, his path was carved. The life of a Viking blacksmith was not chosen. It was bound by blood, and so the son stepped into the fire where the father left off. There was no boyhood for him, no carefree chase across fields, no laughter beneath the sun with other Viking children. Instead, he stood in the half-dark of the smithy, sweat dripping down his brow as he worked the bellows, stoking the furnace until his small arms trembled. The roar of the fire was his lullaby, the hammer's ring his schooling. A father taught not with words, but with silence, grunts, and the back of a hand when a mistake cracked the iron. The son's playthings were not wooden swords or carved boats, but tongs, too heavy for him, hammers that bruised his fingers, sparks that leapt at his face. Each day pressed him harder. Each night he slept blackened with soot. By 12, his palms were calloused, his nails cracked, his lungs already full of smoke. The life that had broken his father was breaking him before he was even grown. Some whispered that the blacksmith's son was fortunate, for he had a trade and would never go hungry. But they did not see him when the forge's heat seared his skin, when he flinched from iron's bite, when his eyes grew hollow from long days bent over the anvil. They did not see how his father's scars had become his own, carved fresh into younger flesh. And yet there was no rebellion. A Viking son who bore the name of Smith was bound to the forge as surely as a warrior was bound to shield and axe. To turn away was to betray his family, to lose his place in the village, to wander as a thrall without honour. So he endured, knowing the fire would consume him just as it had consumed his father. Thus the blacksmith's curse lived on, not in song or saga, but in silence passed from father to son, from scarred hands to fresh ones. Each generation took up the hammer, each generation bent its back to the fire, and each was broken in the same way. The blacksmith's son was not a free man. He was the forge's next servant, bound to repeat a life of burns, scars, and endless toil until the fire claimed him too. The forge was most often the dominion of men, yet the harshness of life spared no one. When a Viking man fell in battle or broke beneath years at the anvil, it was often his wife, sister, or daughter who stepped into the smoke. Women of the forge were rare, but they were real, and their burden was no lighter than the men they replaced. If the hammer weighed heavy in a Viking blacksmith's hands, imagine the toll when a woman gripped it, her arms burning as she fought not only iron, but the doubt of every watching eye. These Viking women were not shield maidens, sung of in sagas, clad in armour and crowned with glory. They were bent-backed, soot-stained, and blistered by the same fire that had already claimed their men. Some worked beside their husbands, feeding bellows, fetching coal, hauling buckets of water when tempers flared and sparks flew. Others bore the heavier curse, keeping the household alive when the smith was too broken to rise. While the man's hands cracked on the anvil, hers blistered on looms and pots, tending children, cattle, and kin with no reprieve. In villages, whispers swirled about such women. A Viking woman at the forge was both respected and pitied, for her life was seen as doubled in toil. Her arms grew strong, her skin rough, Yet still she was expected to bear children, to serve food, to keep the hall warm. The blacksmith's wife cooked Viking food of coarse bread and fish for a man too weary to thank her, then rose in the night to soothe a crying child while embers still smoked on her clothes. And for those few who dared hammer iron themselves, the forge became a battlefield. With each blow of the hammer, they proved their worth, but the scars they carried told of exhaustion beyond measure. They were mocked by some, admired by others, but always they were bound to the same endless cycle of heat and hunger, sweat and smoke. These women bore no songs. Their names were not carved into runestones or sung by skalds. Yet they carried the weight of 2 lives keepers of hearth and helpers of the forge, silent partners in a craft that consumed their men. If Viking men were slaves to fire, then Viking women of the forge were slaves twice over, chained both to iron and to family. Their legacy lies not in glory, but in survival proof that even in a world of warriors, it was not always the sword that crushed the spirit, but the hammer, the bellows, and the endless labour of keeping life itself alive. Iron was not only for ploughs and swords, it was for the gods. The Viking blacksmith was chained not just to his forge, but to faith itself, for the weight of belief often rested on his scarred hands. When a chieftain sought to raise a temple to Odin or Thor, it was the smith who bent the metal into sacred fittings, the hinges of doors that opened into halls of sacrifice, the nails that fastened roof beams over altars darkened with blood. A Viking man might fight with axe and shield, but it was the smith who forged the very steel by which oaths were sworn and lives were ended. In rituals, iron carried a power beyond its use in battle. The spear for sacrifice, tipped with fire-tempered steel, was often crafted in secrecy, the blacksmith labouring through nights when the only witness was the glow of his furnace. Viking priests, the Gotha, came to him with requests for rings, armbands, or blades that would seal sacred vows. The smith's touch, though unpraised, gave these objects weight in the eyes of gods and men alike. Yet for all its holiness, this was no path of honour. The blacksmith was still a servant, called upon but rarely thanked, his sweat hidden beneath the glory of warriors and kings. Superstition clung to him as smoke to his skin. A Viking child might whisper that smiths knew secret words, that they spoke to fire as others spoke to kin. Some villagers believed that a blacksmith's forge was half a temple itself, for iron was thought to ward off spirits and bind the will of the unseen. Yet this ore was edged with fear. If a weapon failed in battle or a ritual ring broke, the blame would fall upon the smith who bore the curse of his own craft. For Viking women who tended shrines or laid offerings, it was the blacksmith's labour they touched without knowing iron nails, driven into wooden idols, chains that bound sacrifice beasts, or fittings that held cauldrons bubbling with sacred broth. In each fragment of faith, the smith's unseen hand left its mark. Thus, the blacksmith stood in a strange place between reverence and ruin, indispensable, yet uncelebrated. His iron outlived him, passing into temples, into graves, into the very rites that gave shape to Viking belief. But the man himself was left to ash, his name unsung, his body broken by years at the anvil. For all the faith he fed with his hammer, his own reward was the same as always: soot in his lungs, scars on his skin, and silence where gratitude should have been. The blacksmith walked among his people, yet never truly with them. To the Viking man who carried his sword, he was essential. To the Viking woman who needed a pot mended, he was necessary. But beneath that respect lived a quiet fear, for all believed that one who bent fire and iron was not entirely like other men. The forge's flames licked at his soul, and many whispered that the blacksmith bore the mark of something beyond human. He was honoured for his craft, yet at the feasts he often sat at the edge, where smoke and shadows clung to him more than company. Children, bold as only Viking children could be, sometimes threw stones at his door, daring one another to see if sparks would fly from his skin. Women drew their cloaks tighter when passing him on the road, muttering that a man who lived with fire day and night could not smell of anything but ash and omens. Even warriors, who owed their lives to his swords and spearheads, often treated him as a man apart needed in the moment of preparation, forgotten in the hour of glory. It was said that smiths could summon storms by striking their anvils, that they could weave curses into a blade as easily as an edge. If a Viking blade snapped in battle, suspicion fell first upon the smith. Had he angered the gods? Had he twisted the iron with some hidden spite? These doubts made him both powerful and perilous, a figure to be respected but never embraced. Even in gatherings, laughter seemed to die at his approach. He carried with him the scent of soot, the tremor of hammer blows echoing in his stance. His voice, often hoarse from smoke, was seldom sought in council. A Viking blacksmith might fashion the tools of war and worship, but in daily life he remained an exile of sorts, present, yet never truly belonging. And so, the blacksmith's place was one of paradox. He stood at the heart of the village, for every hinge, plough, and sword was born from his fire, yet he also lived at its edge, in a hut where the forge roared like a second heartbeat. He was both master and servant, vital and unwanted, revered and avoided. Among the Viking people, no man was more necessary, and no man more alone. The life of a Viking blacksmith was carved in iron, and the body bore the cost long before the hair turned grey. By the time other Viking men still strode the fields with strength, the smith's knees had already bent too many times before the anvil. Hours of lifting hammers heavier than a child, of leaning into bellows, of carrying coal and stone, left the joints swollen and screaming. A Viking child might watch his father rise from the bench and think him an old man, though he had not yet seen 40 winters. The back was the first to betray him. Day after day he stooped over the fire, hauling iron glowing white, twisting it with tongs, while sweat poured into his eyes. The spine bent under the weight of years until the smith's stance became a permanent hunch, his body shaped not by nature but by the forge. When he walked through the village, a Viking woman might pity him, but none would envy him. His body was a tool worn thin, like a blade ground too often upon the whetstone. The lungs, too, blackened with every breath. The forge was no place of clean air, smoke curled thick as wool inside the hut, choking the chest and searing the throat. Each cough rattled like iron, struck against iron, a grim rhythm that followed him into the night. Sleep brought no healing, only the rasp of laboured breath. By middle age, many blacksmiths wheezed like men twice their years, their strength eaten from within. Even the eyes betrayed him, endless hours staring into flame and glowing metal dulled sight before its time. Sparks blinded, smoke clouded, the fire itself seemed to gnaw at his vision. By the time a Viking smith reached his waning years, if he lived so long, he often worked half blind, guided more by memory and touch than by sight. Thus, the body of the smith gave out far too early. Where the warrior's scars told of battles won, the blacksmith's scars told of battles with his own craft. Each blister, burn, and ache, another tally in a war without glory. Before 40 winters, he often looked as if he had endured twice that. A Viking man might die with a sword in his hand, but the blacksmith more often died hunched over, broken by his tools, his strength stolen by the fire he served. The forge did not grant long life. It consumed it. The sea was the great road of the north, but without the blacksmith, no Viking ship would have ever left its shore. The sea kings, those proud Viking men, who dreamed of raiding across horizons, owed their glory to the sweat of the forge. Each keel, each plank, each curved board of oak depended not only on the carpenter's hand, but on the countless nails and rivets that bound them together. And those were born of fire, hammer, and the smith's toil. It was said a single longship could drink down thousands of iron nails before it was seaworthy. Imagine the blacksmith's task, day upon day before the roaring fire, striking iron until his arms throbbed, shaping each rivet with care. Without his labour, the prow carved like a serpent would never kiss the waves, nor the dragon-headed vessel ever glide into distant harbours. The Viking sea kings carried fame and treasure home, yet it was the blacksmith who held the hidden key to their journeys. Still, no songs were sung for him. A Viking child would hear tales of men leaping ashore, swords flashing, shields splintering, but never of the bent-backed smith who forged the very nails that held the ship together. His hands were the unseen keel, his hammer the pulse behind the oars, yet his name rarely reached the sagas. He was needed, yes, but celebrated? Never. And what of the burden? Each new voyage meant another demand, another mountain of nails and fittings. The blacksmith could not rest. When a chieftain prepared a fleet, the forge glowed day and night, swallowing the smith's health as surely as the sea swallowed lives. His children, too, felt the weight, feeding the fire, hauling iron, shaping wood for bellows. It was a chain of exhaustion tied to the dreams of Viking lords. Yet, in his heart, the smith knew his work was more than survival. He was the one who built the road over the sea, one rivet at a time. The hammer echoed like oar strokes, each strike another beat of destiny. When the longships sailed, their hulls groaning with iron bones, it was the blacksmith's spirit that rode with them silent, unthanked, but eternal. For without the forge, the sea kings were nothing, and every Viking voyage, whether ending in glory or in grave, bore the mark of the smith who had given his strength to make it possible. The blacksmith's fire was more than heat and hammer, it was mystery. To the common Viking man, the forge was a place of whispers, where sparks leapt like spirits and iron bent as if under spell. Few understood how cold, lifeless ore could be drawn from the earth, crushed, smelted, and beaten into blades sharp enough to spill blood, or nails strong enough to bind ships. So they said the smiths carried secrets, gifts, not entirely of this world. Rumours spread in smoky halls that a blacksmith did not merely strike with his hammer, but chanted softly as he worked, runes scratched into wood or stone beside him. Viking women would murmur that he spat into the fire, or pricked his hand so blood might temper the metal. A Viking child, creeping near to watch, swore he heard the smith speak to the iron as though it were alive. Whether truth or tale, such whispers clung like soot to the smith's name. It was no wonder. Iron itself was seen as a thing of power, born from the bones of the earth, hardened in the breath of fire. To shape it was to command nature's fiercest spirits, and men believed such control must come from some bargain with gods or darker forces. A sword tempered with the right rune, they said, could bite deeper, while a cursed blade might turn against its wielder. Smiths were called upon to forge weapons for oath-takings and sacrifices. Their hands trusted with objects too sacred for common eyes. But trust was never whole. Just as a Viking warrior might prize the blade, he might also fear the one who birthed it. To share bread with the blacksmith was to share it with a man who walked between worlds, the realm of fire and the realm of flesh. His work was necessary, yet his presence unsettled. Too close to fire, too close to secrets, too close to the gods themselves. And so the smith lived in half light, half respected, half feared. Some would bow their heads when passing his forge, others would whisper charms to protect themselves from the smoke that rolled from his chimney. He bore it in silence, for what else could he do? His hammer rang out, day after day, each strike another echo of magic, whether true or only imagined. For the blacksmith knew this. Rumour was power. Let them believe his chant guided the blade, let them fear the rune at the hilt. In such shadows lay a strength greater than muscle. The Viking forge was not only iron and fire, it was myth, and in that myth the smith's soul was forever bound. The graves of blacksmiths lie quiet, hidden beneath the soil, unmarked by carved stone or towering mound. A Viking warrior might be buried with his sword upon his breast, a chieftain with gold and weapons, a Viking woman with brooches and beads to sing her worth. But the smith, who had forged it all, was laid down with little more than the soot that clung to his skin. His life's work did not rest in his grave, it lived on in the iron that outlasted him. Every hinge upon a Viking door, every rivet in a ship's ribs, every nail that bound plank to plank, was a silent remembrance. A sword ringing in battle was his unspoken legacy, its steel edge carrying the memory of his hammer. Yet, when the man himself was gone, few sang of him. The fire that had burned his body hollow was forgotten once it cooled, his name fading like smoke on the wind. The forge consumed men as surely as war, but without the glory. Where a Viking man might boast of raids, a smith's scars told no tales that hall men cared to hear. His grave was not visited by scolds. No saga remembered the ache in his shoulders, the black in his lungs, the countless nights he bent iron into shape while others feasted. He was the firekeeper, and when his breath ended, another boy, another Viking child, apprentice too young, took up the bellows, and the cycle endured. Still, the earth remembers. Dig into the ruins of long-forgotten halls, and you will find them not bones alone, but the works of their hands. Bent nails, broken knives, shards of tools, blackened with age, these are the smith's true tombstones. Every rusted fragment whispers of the man who once stood in firelight, hammer raised, sweat pouring down his face as sparks flew like stars. Their ghosts do not haunt the barrows of kings. They haunt the clang of metal, the creak of doors, the whisper of blades drawn from sheaths. They are present in every Viking voyage across the sea, in every shield raised against an enemy's strike. Though their graves were forgotten, their work was eternal, and in that eternity lies a kind of immortality. The blacksmiths were not sung of, but they were never truly lost. Their epitaphs are written not in runes, but in iron itself, iron that endures long after their names have faded. And so, though the graves of firekeepers lie unmarked and silent, their memory is carried still, every time a Viking hand clasps steel, every time iron meets iron, and sings its harsh, enduring song. In the end, when the smoke of centuries clears, it is not the shouts of Viking warriors, nor the feasts of Viking chieftains that endure most strongly, but the silent beat of the smith's hammer. Every village, every ship, every hall owed its bones to the firekeeper who bent ore into form. Without his rivets, the long ships that carried Viking men across oceans would have fallen apart on the first storm. Without his blades, Viking warriors would have gone to battle, armed with sticks and stones. Without his hinges, locks, and tools, even the hearths of Viking women would have faltered. Though his life was misery, lungs charred, hands broken, body bent long before its time, his legacy was iron itself. He held together a world that often forgot him. The forge was his prison, yet also his altar, where he gave his strength so others might stride into glory. Kings were crowned, warriors were sung, but their power was only as sharp as the edge he had drawn from fire. When the sagas spoke of gleaming swords with names, of helmets that shone in torchlight, it was the blacksmith's spirit that lingered there, hidden between lines of poetry. His fire was quiet, but it burned longer than fame. Every Viking child who clutched a knife, every farmer who swung an axe, every sailor who trusted the nails of his ship, all bore the unseen mark of the smith. The irony was cruel. The man himself died in soot and silence, yet his work outlived him by centuries. Dig into the earth where old halls lie buried, and you find his ghosts in rusted nails, bent keys, warped spearheads. They are the true sagas he left behind, not carved in runes, but in the iron that once sang beneath his hammer. And so the Viking blacksmith is remembered, not by name, but by necessity. He was the unseen spine of the north, the keeper of flame, the mender of broken steel, the builder of journeys. His life was hardship, yet his work was the bedrock of glory. For though kings ruled and warriors fought, it was the smith who gave them the means to do so. In the end, his legacy was not misery, it was endurance, carved into every blade, every ship, every hinge that bore the weight of the Viking world.